Go on, Professor Brain. You won't hear anything useful from it. The situation seemed on the verge of spiraling out of control. Hagrid fidgeted anxiously, but Amasta remained calm, staring down at Aragog, completely unmoved and unwilling to retreat. The smaller spiders kept inching closer. Hagrid finally reached out, intending to pull Amasta away, but just as his fingertips brushed the front of Amasta's robes, a swirling vortex ignited in Amasta's eyes. The rain streaming down from the gloomy sky transformed into individual droplets. They seemed to escape the pull of gravity, frozen midair. Fallen leaves, disturbed by the vortex, bounced back into the air upon touching the ground, moving slowly but with resolute purpose. The fine rain droplets captured every arc of their movement. This astonishing spectacle reflected in Hagrid's eyes, temporarily making him forget that he himself could not move. A gentle breeze stirred, rain left its traces, and time seemed frozen, as if the world had been trapped in amber about to harden. All sound came to a halt. The spiders remained poised, their massive fangs raised, only their trembling, terrified eyes betraying that they were still alive. Amasta methodically swept away drifting leaves from the space before him, weaving through clusters of bushes, slipping past the barricade of smaller spiders, step by step, until he stood before the blind elder spider at the bottom of the pit. Very well. He raised his arm, gently pressing his wand against Aragog's head. His eyes were steely, and his soft voice carried the weight of thunder. For Hagrid's sake, I'll give you a chance to speak the truth. The breeze brushed over the pit, and Aragog regained some control over its massive body. Still, it remained silent, its worn mandibles clicking sharply against one another like a clattering rattle. I cannot, the spider whispered tremulously. The fear is in the blood. We cannot resist it. Tricky, Amasta murmured, running a hand through his damp hair. If you refuse to speak, Aragog, I'll have to delve into your mind myself. Honestly, I'd rather not, as it could affect your health. No? Hagrid, perched on the edge of the pit, blinked desperately. He struggled, but the magical restraint on his body was like the petrification curse that had trapped Colin Creevey and Justin Finch Fletchley. It wasn't something sheer willpower could overcome. No matter how hard Hagrid tried, he could only watch as Amasta's wand flared again. Amasta. Just as Hagrid feared the worst for Aragog, a familiar, aged voice echoed behind him. Before he could react, a silver light streaked across his body, appearing above Amasta, poised to strike. A silver phoenix flapped its wings gently, scattering flecks of glowing light over the darkened surroundings. It's foolish to decide to destroy some lives in order to save others, Amasta. Leave this poor spider be, it has suffered enough. The surrounding magic remained frozen, yet the Silver Guardian, embodying Dumbledore's spirit and will, seemed entirely unaffected. It hovered calmly in midair, locking eyes with Amasta. The cold air was thick with silent pressure, a confrontation without words, whose victor was obvious. I apologize, Hagrid. Earlier in the Forbidden Forest, I may have been rough with your friend. I hope you can forgive me, Amasta said, his voice tinged with regret. I don't know why, but these past 2 years I've developed a bad habit. When others treat me poorly, I find it hard to control my temper. It's not your fault, Professor Breen. Aragog does have a nasty temper, Hagrid said, pale-faced but managing a weak smile, as if recently recovered from a serious illness. Rain still fell lightly from the murky sky, making it impossible for Amasta to judge the time. But passing the Quidditch pitch, he noticed the drenched Gryffindor team huddled under the stands, shivering and nibbling sandwiches. He realized it must be around lunchtime. Professor Breen! Hermione, spraying hot air from her wand to dry Harry's wet hair, spotted Amasta walking along the central courtyard path from Hagrid's hut toward the castle. She was so excited she nearly singed Harry's eyes with the wand's flame. Ah, Miss Granger, Amasta said, slightly annoyed after the unnecessary detour and Dumbledore's mild rebuke. Do you need something? Braving the rain, Hermione ran forward happily. Where did you go this morning? I went to your office, but you weren't there. Are we still helping Professor Lockhart with his correspondence at the usual time tomorrow? Helping Lockhart? Amasta paused. Since discovering those amusing little secrets in Lockhart's office last weekend, he hadn't thought much about it. But now that Hermione brought it up, ignoring it didn't seem right. Sorry, I had to see Hagrid this morning. Yes, the usual time, Miss Granger. He nodded, then glanced at Ron, who looked unimpressed by the topic, and Harry, who was intensely curious about his visit to Hagrid. His eyes twinkled with a hidden meaning. You'd better bring some help, Miss Granger. Handling all that mail between the two of us is a bit much. The year 2022 had not been an easy one for many, but somehow we made it through. Here's to hoping 2023 brings new beginnings and bright prospects for everyone. Happy New Year. Chapter 57, Rainy Days. Bring some help. Hermione hesitated for a moment, not because she was unwilling to share the honor, but without Professor Lockhart's permission, going through his private letters with unrelated people felt questionable. Still, handling an entire week's worth of fan mail for the famous Professor Lockhart, even with just herself and Professor Brain, was no small task. With that in mind, Hermione slowly turned to look at Harry and Ron. Unsurprisingly, one of them was pretending to fix his glasses, while the other was suddenly examining an old broomstick with branches barely holding on. Neither met her gaze. Seeing this, the Gryffindor Quidditch team stifled giggles. Fred and George's expressions were the most exaggerated, but before they could come up with a joke, Professor Brain's sweeping glance immediately silenced them. The Weasley twins knew better than anyone. This defense against the dark arts professor was not one to be trifled with. If you really can't manage it, forget it. Amostar gave Hermione a sympathetic smile, then turned and left. You too, Hermione called after them. Tomorrow you're coming with me to Professor Lockhart's office. Otherwise, you'll never get to borrow my homework again. Spare us, Hermione. I never want to touch that stuff again in my life. I'd rather polish the trophies in Filch's cupboard. Amostar, several dozen feet away, could faintly hear their wails and Hermione's scolding riding on the gust of wind. At the 4 long tables in the Great Hall, scattered students were seated. Over in Slytherin, Malfoy was proudly demonstrating a new spell to Pansy and Daphne. In Hufflepuff, 4th-year Cedric and a few friends strolled toward the entrance, arm in arm. Passing behind a 3rd-year Ravenclaw girl of Chinese descent, he quietly slipped a letter into her pocket, his 3rd love note of the semester. She didn't seem to notice, continuing to chat and laugh with Marietta, but from Amosta's past experience with romance, the girl's gradually reddening cheeks suggested she wasn't far from falling completely. Do we really have to do this, Professor Brain? Professor McGonagall looked far healthier than she had over the Christmas break. One reason was that ever since Amostar arrived, the heir of Slytherin had been quiet. Another was that Headmaster Dumbledore spent noticeably more time in his office this term, providing her with a sense of security. Sitting at the staff table, Amostar pursed his lips with a wry smile. McGonagall, using his surname, hinted she had a lot on her mind. Honestly, Amostar, in the last decade, you're probably the most competent defense against the dark arts professor Hogwarts has seen. Based on your previous classes, introducing students to ways to combat evil while sharing your inventive spell modifications, I think calling Amostar's new spells interesting is an understatement, Minerva. Professor Flitwick jumped up from his chair enthusiastically. Those are spells only a true genius could create. He looked at Amostar seriously. Once you step down from Defense Against the Dark Arts, you could run a course on spell model structure optimization at Hogwarts, integrated into advanced charms. I'd bet students would fight for a spot in your class, Amostar. No problem, Professor Flitwick. Once Dumbledore rides west, I'll happily return to Hogwarts for retirement. Amostar smiled, agreeing. He saw that McGonagall still wanted to continue the conversation, so he immediately turned to greet the professor sitting at the far end, with oversized glasses and countless chains and beads draped around her neck. What wind blew you down from the tower, Professor Trelawney? Hick. The disheveled Trelawney belched, giving Amostar a dazed glance. The encroaching darkness has blurred my 3rd eye. When did you return to Hogwarts, Amostar? The truth is, Professor Flitwick whispered into Amostar's ear, Sybil ran out of sherry upstairs. Oh, keep it down, Professor Flitwick. Amostar tensed, clearly nervous. I don't want to be prophesied into misfortune again. When Harry, Hermione, and Ron, forced back into the castle by sudden gusts of wind and rain, returned to the Great Hall for a quick meal, they saw Professor Flitwick laughing so hard he nearly fell off his chair, and Professor McGonagall, cheeks flushed, lips tightly pressed, body trembling slightly. Professor Breen was standing before a professor they hadn't really encountered before, hands clasped together, his face full of apology. What do you two think they were talking about just now? Once Hermione stepped into the warm common room, her expression thoughtful. She asked, "Doesn't matter, Hermione." Harry, bleary-eyed after waking early and battling the cold rain all morning, slumped in his chair. "I just want to crawl back into my warm bed and sleep straight through until Professor Breen's Defense Against the Dark Arts class on Monday afternoon." With that, he left Hermione and Ron behind, staggering off toward the dormitory. The gloomy, rainy weather was bothersome, but for someone who had the luxury of a long, uninterrupted nap, it was perfect. That Saturday afternoon, Harry indulged in a rare, deep sleep. Ron had apparently tried to wake him, but Harry mumbled something unintelligible and turned over, sinking back into slumber. When he finally rubbed his eyes and sat up, the clouds over the castle had cleared entirely. Hogwarts basked in the pale glow of the moonlight. The darkened dormitory was silent, completely empty. If Harry guessed correctly, Ron and Seamus were likely downstairs in the common room playing wizard's chess, or perhaps gobstones. Hermione, on the other hand, was either in the library studying or in the common room working on homework. "Why didn't anyone wake me for dinner?" Harry muttered softly to himself as he dressed, still half-dazed, though he knew Ron had probably tried and failed to wake him. The air was tinged with the faint, sour smell of sweat, coming from Harry's Quidditch uniform, which he had tossed on the floor beside the bed. He threw it into the laundry basket, then slowly walked to the desk and opened the window to air out the room. The breeze from the Black Lake helped focus his scattered thoughts. He sat down, eyes fixed on the parchment in front of him, his History of Magic essay, mostly completed. For a brief 2 minutes, the little voices of conscience and laziness wrestled in Harry's mind. Laziness, as usual, won, standing triumphant over the shredded remains of conscience. "Maybe Hermione can give me some good advice," he muttered as he folded the parchment, slipping it into his bag. Under the dim light, the black notebook that had been residing in his bag for days pulsed with a quiet, mysterious magic. Absent-mindedly, his hand reached for a quill. Chapter 58. Probing. If he could, Harry wished he had never discovered the correct way to read the notebook in his bag. Then he wouldn't have to face the headache of the questions it presented. "Riddle may have picked the wrong person," he muttered. At times, Hermione's expressions mirrored Professor McGonagall's strikingly, two Gryffindors of the same type. At that moment, Hermione's pursed lips reminded Harry of McGonagall catching Seamus causing another explosion in Transfiguration class, or Neville injuring himself again. Maybe the culprit is another monster. "You think there's more than one monster in here, Hermione?" Ron asked lazily. Harry understood Hermione's desire to defend Hagrid perfectly, but even she probably couldn't fully believe the flimsy excuses she conjured. "I should have known this would involve Hagrid," Harry muttered, staring into the crackling fireplace, his expression troubled. "Remember, Ron, during the Christmas break when Hagrid found out that Professor Breen had returned to Hogwarts as an investigator for the Chamber of Secrets, I sensed something was off, but I thought Hagrid just knew a few secrets about the chamber." The three of them fell silent. After a long, heavy pause, Hermione brought up the thorny question. "Do you think we should ask Hagrid about all this?" "That'll be an enjoyable visit, I'm sure," Ron said with a smirk. "How would we even ask, Hermione?" "Hello, Hagrid. Did you happen to release some savage, hairy monster in the castle last term?" Another oppressive silence fell. This time it was Harry who broke it. "At lunchtime today, Professor Breen said he visited Hagrid, but as far as I know, they're not exactly close. But the fact is, Professor Brain hasn't arrested Hagrid, has he?" Hermione furrowed her brow as she analyzed the situation. "Perhaps that proves Hagrid's innocence, and Harry, don't forget, it was Headmaster Dumbledore who kept Hagrid at Hogwarts. If Hagrid really... Dumbledore is a great and kind man, Hermione. We all know that." Faced with the ironclad truth, Hermione's pale, powerless insistence only frustrated Ron. He raised his voice slightly. "No one thinks Hagrid intentionally murdered that poor girl 50 years ago. But the problem is, he sometimes doesn't understand how dangerous those massive furry creatures can be." The discussion ended without any clear conclusion. Hermione thought that since Professor Brain might already suspect Hagrid's connection to the Chamber of Secrets from 50 years ago, it couldn't hurt to give him the notebook. Perhaps he could confront Riddle within its pages. Unsurprisingly, Harry strongly opposed this plan, and his reasoning left Hermione unable to argue. "I will not give the notebook to Professor Brain, Hermione," Harry said, his expression vexed. "Think about it. What if Professor Brain has no idea about this? That would be like handing Hagrid straight into the wizard prison Malfoy talks about. Do you want me to spend the rest of my life repenting for that?" Because last week's letters hadn't yet been fully dealt with, it was past 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon when Amasta opened Professor Lockhart's office, sealed for a week. A wave of white paper surged out, nearly burying him completely. There was not a single inch of floor space left. "We'll have to change locations, everyone." Climbing out of the paper tide, Amasta looked helplessly at Hermione, who had suddenly reverted to her original reserved demeanor, and at Harry and Ron behind her, their expressions betraying their thoughts. In the end, Amasta reluctantly offered up his own office. Hermione and Harry had been there before, but it was Ron's first time stepping into the investigator's workspace. He eyed everything with curiosity, focusing especially on the surveillance wall hidden behind a curtain. "That's the one," Ron whispered to Harry, eyes wide with awe. Hermione quickly shot him a severe look, silencing him before he could finish. Seeing this, Amasta smiled. With a wave of his wand, he drew back the curtain, proudly revealing the magical wall to all three of them. "For others, I might need to be discreet, but you three clearly already know me inside and out, right?" The trio laughed, sheepishly. With Amasta's permission, they thoroughly admired the Hogwarts on the wall. Harry and Ron watched for fun, but Hermione discerned a bit of its underlying mechanics. "Such advanced transfiguration magic? I'll probably never be able to cast this in my lifetime," she said at the end, looking both awed and disappointed. "Don't underestimate yourself, Miss Granger. You have a remarkable talent for spells. Keep your humble, dedicated attitude, and one day, even this will be no challenge for you." To avoid interfering with the ongoing work, Amasta closed the surveillance wall again. When he turned, he noticed Miss Granger, praised just moments ago, had her ears slightly red. Even with double the hands, writing replies to Lockhart's fans was still a tedious, painful task. Amasta continued at a leisurely pace, unwilling even to pick up a quill himself. Instead, he waved his wand, making each sheet float to him as the quill wrote on its own, while he immersed himself in studying the ancient manuscript. Harry and Ron watched, gritting their teeth in envy, but neither dared to imitate him. Time slowly passed, and the sun began to set. By dinner, Amasta used the excuse of fetching their meals to take a short stroll outside. When he returned, a sizable portion of the remaining letters had disappeared. Hermione glared angrily at Harry and Ron. Amasta smiled, guessing exactly what had happened. "Take a break for now, ladies and gentlemen. There's no need to rush." Professor Breen had almost no airs when chatting with people. In fact, it was easy to forget he was a professor and an investigator. He came across more like an older student at Hogwarts, which gave Harry the courage to voice the question that had been gnawing at him. "Professor Breen, yesterday morning, you went to visit Hagrid?" Harry tried to sound casual, framing it as an offhand remark in conversation. But his clenched fists and the sudden, almost eerie silence from Hermione and Ron made it clear to Breen that this question had been carefully planned. Chapter 59, Differences, just a personal matter. As expected, the moment Breen spoke those words, the three of them tensed up. Hermione frantically signaled to Harry with her eyes, while Ron stared nervously at his toes. Their reactions made Harry, who had resolved to get to the bottom of this, suddenly hesitate. Interesting. What exactly are these three little ones trying to pry from me? Breen regarded them with amusement. "You three seem very curious about the purpose of my visit to Hagrid?" "That's right, Professor Breen." Harry carefully modulated his tone, trying not to sound suspicious. "Hagrid is our best friend, and you're, well, an investigator." He trailed off, unsure how to continue. Breen nodded knowingly. "You're worried the Chamber of Secrets has something to do with Hagrid, so you're concerned that I went to investigate him?" Harry's face went pale, and Ron's cheeks flushed. Hermione, after a brief pause, broke the awkward silence with a flicker of her eyes and a light, reassuring tone. Sorry, Professor Breen, I've already told him. This is just wild speculation. Hagrid is the headmaster's most trusted keeper of the forest. He couldn't possibly have any connection to the Slytherin chamber, right? Breen lowered his gaze and smiled faintly. Miss Granger, you're still about 30 years away from mastering the art of playing hard to get in front of me. He remained thoughtful, neither confirming nor denying her words, simply smiling at the three of them. His voice was calm and even. In truth, purely theoretical lessons and exercises can never fully prepare you for dangers that may arise at any moment. So, according to the tradition of defense against the dark arts, I believe it's necessary for you to encounter some truly dangerous creatures. Seeing Hermione and the others listening intently, Breen paused, shrugged, and continued. Hogwarts' Forbidden Forest is home to many fascinating magical creatures, and Hagrid is the person here who knows it best, so I asked him to guide me. Phew! Hearing his explanation, the three of them simultaneously exhaled in relief, their expressions visibly relaxing. Under Breen's playful gaze, Harry twisted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing his back was drenched in sweat from the brief but tense exchange. May I ask, what have you prepared for us? Ron's eyes lit up. I know there are unicorns and centaurs, but Fred and George told me the forest has far more interesting things than that. Ha! Breen leaned back in his chair, tilting his head, his voice taking on a mysterious tone. That falls under the category of secrets, Mr. Weasley. You must understand that how you react to unknown dangers is just as important. I'm not planning to give you any time to prepare in advance, and don't even think about going back to Hagrid for hints. I've already told him he must not reveal a single word to anyone. In short, the three of you, get ready for a surprise. Breen's words made their eyes sparkle with excitement and curiosity. Even Hermione couldn't resist asking for a hint, only to be flatly denied. I can only tell you this, I've prepared 3 dark creatures of varying danger levels. Each year will face one. The rest, don't even think about asking. The discussion of this intriguing topic lasted over half an hour. No matter how subtly Harry and Ron tried to probe, Amasta just smiled and remained silent, letting them speculate. By the end, even Hermione had set aside Lockhart's fan mail and joined the lively debate. The cheerful atmosphere was so infectious that Ron forgot all about Amasta's status as a professor. Looking at him, he muttered with a hint of complaint, It's unbelievable, Professor. How can a wizard as amazing as you come from Slytherin? Noticing Hermione's warning glance, Ron quickly rephrased himself. I mean, we've never met a Slytherin as friendly as you. The Slytherins we've met always brag about pure blood and honor, looking down on Muggleborns, but you've never mentioned any of that. Honestly, you seem more like a Gryffindor. Harry and Hermione immediately nodded in agreement. Clearly, they had been puzzled by this themselves for some time. Actually, sometimes Slytherin and Gryffindor aren't that different, Amasta said matter-of-factly. The trio exchanged bewildered glances. Slytherin and Gryffindor? Alike? That was a completely new idea. In everyone's mind, the two houses were bitter rivals. This division had existed since the 4 founders established Hogwarts centuries ago. Even the recent Chamber of Secrets incident had roots in this deep-seated divide. Should he add a little trouble for Dumbledore? Noticing Harry's skeptical gaze, Amasta smirked and cleared his throat. According to Headmaster Dumbledore, the strongest, most unstoppable force in the world is love. Love gives courage. Courage empowers people to face any misfortune. This idea aligns perfectly with Godric Gryffindor's philosophy. Isn't that right, Professor Brain? At the mention of Dumbledore, Harry became immediately attentive, and Hermione tensed, watching Amasta anxiously, afraid he might say something about purebloods being noble or half-bloods inferior. Many things in this world have no single answer, Potter, Amasta said with a gentle shake of his head and a light laugh. I'm not saying Gryffindor's or Dumbledore's philosophy is flawed or wrong, just that I have my own perspective. Before Harry or Hermione could ask more, Amasta continued, In my view, no matter how intense love or hatred is, it cannot make an ordinary person lift a 500-pound stone without magic. Potter, I believe strength is simply strength. It is a pure, tangible thing. Love or hate alone cannot grant extraordinary power, though these extreme emotions can spark a determination to pursue it. He glanced at the three, deep in thought, then turned to the window. The stars still dotted the endless black sky, an eternal, mysterious universe that countless wizards and muggles alike dreamed of exploring. After a long pause, Amasta lowered his gaze, smiling softly. If you insist on linking power and courage to love, I would rather say this: strength gives a person the infinite courage to pursue love and freedom. Which do you think is right, Ron? On his four-poster bed, Harry recalled Professor Brain's solitary, yearning aura as he gazed at the stars and asked quietly, I don't know, Harry, Ron mumbled, turning over, but I think, compared to love, I probably lack strength more. Chapter 60, Making Progress. Harry, Hermione, and Ron had already left. The office was silent except for Amasta. The candlelight flickered, casting moving shadows along the walls. He watched the surveillance wall intently, only turning away after making sure the three had safely returned to the common room. Early March wasn't as bone-chillingly cold anymore, but the fireplace still roared with life, making the room slightly warm. Amasta walked to the window and opened it, letting his gaze wander aimlessly. For some reason, the quiet of this otherwise comfortable office felt maddening. The ancient castle still stood silently atop the highlands, while the forest nearby had witnessed countless legends that once shone brilliantly, only to fade into obscurity. Staring at the rolling trees, Amasta's thoughts turned to Voldemort, willing to tear apart a soul brimming with magical power to achieve immortality. Immortality? Amasta laughed bitterly. The universe had been racing toward its end since birth. Life was but a fleeting splash in the river of time. In this vast cosmos, what could truly stand alongside eternity? For both muggles and wizards, the only constant companion in a brief life was solitude, he reminded himself. Feeling momentarily listless, Amasta closed the window and turned, but paused mid-step, his brow furrowing. In the invisible realm of magic, the latent energy floating lazily like clouds suddenly surged toward him, drawn by an inexplicable force. It was as if a hidden pit had opened beneath a calm lake, sending spirals across the water's surface. Amasta's handsome face tightened in concentration, his lavender eyes swirling like whirlpools as he absorbed the influx of power. What exactly are you scheming, Dumbledore? In the headmaster's office, Snape leaned over the desk, eyes locked on Dumbledore sitting in his chair, fingers steepled, attempting to discern any clue from those unfathomable blue eyes. Oh, fascinating, Severus, Dumbledore replied calmly, smiling. You actually tried legilimency on me, but forgive my arrogance. No matter how old I get, even when my teeth fall out and I can no longer eat sweets, you'd still fail. Not only Amasta is puzzled, I'm very curious as well, Dumbledore. Snape's face twitched. He leaned back slightly, no longer quite so aggressive in expression, but his voice remained sharp. From what I know of you, whether it's Amasta monitoring the students or the challenges he's proposed in class, you wouldn't approve. But you went along with it anyway. Dumbledore, when did you become so lenient? Last year, with Quirrell at Hogwarts, you were far more cautious than you are with Amasta. Severus, are you trying to discuss the difference between Quirrell and Amasta with me? You're evading the point, Dumbledore. Snape's veins bulged along his hands, and a flush rose on his pale cheeks. The tolerance you've shown toward Amasta is completely out of character. Unless you're plotting something, I can't see any other explanation. Fawkes, accustomed to these sporadic outbursts, remained asleep, tucking its head under wings glowing with iridescent light, letting out a soft chirp and returning to its dreams. Severus, Dumbledore murmured, eyebrows and white beard twitching slightly in mild exasperation. He was about to explain, but suddenly something caught his attention. He zipped to the window, staring intently into the boundless darkness beyond the carved frame. Silence fell. The room, unique in style, was cloaked in stillness. For a moment, no one spoke. Remarkable. After roughly 10 minutes, Dumbledore's furrowed brows relaxed and his blue eyes twinkled with a quiet amusement. He muttered under his breath, only audible to himself. Without a doubt, from the era of the four founders to now, in 1,000 years, you may well be Hogwarts' most outstanding student. The turbulence of magic subsided. Amasta exhaled deeply. When he finally regained his senses, he realized that in just those 10 minutes, both his wool underlayer and wizard robe were completely soaked. What is this? He muttered, a ridiculous smile spreading across his face. Have I had an epiphany? For a wizard, after the initial period of chaotic magical surges in childhood, One's internal magic gradually stabilizes with age. Unless taking highly risky potions or undergoing dangerous modifications, ordinary magical enhancers can only slightly boost one's power, which reverts back once the effects fade. Perhaps it was because the wizarding lineage had once been broken, or perhaps no one had ever truly figured out how to artificially accelerate magical growth. In any case, every opportunity to achieve a sudden, extraordinary surge in power was rare and fleeting. Could it be that I'm growing restless and really ought to find a companion? Amasta shook his head and chuckled at the thought, recalling the rare magical surge he had just experienced due to a shift in his mood. No, a woman would only slow my casting speed. He calmed himself and reaffirmed the thought. Suddenly, his eyelashes twitched. With his heightened perception, he sensed that someone might be watching him from the darkness beyond the window. He fixed his gaze on the pitch-black exterior, tracing the direction from which the sense of being observed emanated. After a long moment, his tense expression softened. He retrieved a teapot from the shelf above the fireplace, lifted a steaming cup, and saluted toward the window. "To the solitary traveler," Amasta whispered with a soft smile, then drank the hot tea in one go. "Have you noticed something?" On Monday afternoon, during the first Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson for first and second years, Hermione squinted at Professor Amasta atop the podium, noticing his movements were sharper than usual. A flicker of suspicion lit her eyes as she whispered to Harry and Ron, "Professor Brain's eye color? It seems darker than last night." "I've never understood why Professor Brain's eyes look different from when he first came to Hogwarts." Harry shrugged. Even with his glasses, his eyesight wasn't as keen as Hermione's. Ron, however, hesitated and nodded. Maybe he stayed up too late answering all of Lockhart's fan mail last night, had nightmares, and didn't sleep well. Hermione glared at him for the absurd guess. Maybe next weekend we can ask him directly. Professor Brain is approachable. He might actually tell us. As the official lesson was about to begin, Hermione filed the thought away, clearing her mind to focus fully on the eloquent Professor Brain. Chapter 61, The Unknown. Just as I explained to you earlier, to everyone's surprise, today's practical Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson wasn't held in the Great Hall. After a brief explanation of his plan, Professor Brain led the students in a grand procession to an abandoned classroom near the 8th floor corridor by Dumbledore's office. Smiling at the slightly overexcited students in the hallway, Amasta explained, "I've used a complex spell to slightly expand the space within this classroom to house the dark creature you'll be facing." "What exactly is it, Professor Brain?" Wayne Hopkins, a second-year Hufflepuff, raised his hand, his eyes full of awe as he glanced at Harry, who was quietly discussing with Hermione and Ron. "Could it be a troll?" "Sorry, Hopkins. As I said before, I won't let anyone know the creature's name in advance. If you want to see it, you'll have to witness it with your own eyes. For now, I'll explain the rules of this game." Amasta leaned against the oak door, arms crossed, smiling. "Second years will pair up in twos, first years in threes to face the creature inside. Each group has a strict 10-minute limit. Exceeding the time or dying counts as a failure." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many students picked up on the weight of his words. Harry and Ron exchanged glances, both sensing the unease in each other's eyes. From their knowledge of Professor Brain, the creature in the classroom was likely far beyond anything interesting or trivial. The Malfoy in the crowd had begun trembling, thinking of one terrifying possibility, but he refused to believe it. Death. Neville's voice shook so badly it seemed he might faint at any moment. Fortunately, Hermione was still composed. She shot Neville an exasperated glare and, lowering her voice into a scolding tone, said, "Professor Amasta would never allow anyone to die, Neville. Neither Headmaster Dumbledore nor the Ministry would permit it." "That remains to be seen, Miss Granger," Amasta replied, his expression playful, the faint curl of his lips sending chills down many spines. "If I were to list all the rules I've bent and broken over the years, you'd probably be terrified. All I can say is, I try to avoid seeing anyone heroically sacrificed in this trial." With a flourish of his wand, a piece of parchment shimmered into existence before them. Amasta scanned the crowd, then sent the magical contract floating directly into Hermione's hands. "Before anyone enters this classroom, they must sign their name on this magical contract, Miss Granger. Would you kindly read the terms aloud for everyone? Hermione eagerly began reading. After just a few lines, the confidence she had shown moments ago drained from her face. Her cheeks, once lightly flushed, turned pale. Beside her, Harry, Ron, and Neville all felt as though a hand had clamped around their throats. Even breathing became difficult. Hermione stared at Professor Amasta, hoping it was some sort of April Fool's joke, but the seriousness in his eyes left no doubt. With other students behind her impatiently urging her on, Hermione had no choice but to fulfill her duty. 1. Anyone entering this classroom for the trial, regardless of success or failure, may not reveal anything they witness inside. Gentrine, those not participating are likewise forbidden from inquiring. 2. Each group will have 2 attempts at the trial. If the first attempt fails, during the second attempt, no one may ask for help or consult any external materials. Only group members may discuss strategies amongst themselves. Amasta smiled and interrupted Hermione, addressing the students. The purpose of these first 2 rules is to ensure that everyone must rely on their own wits and their companions' intelligence to overcome the darkness inside. Most importantly, the third rule, Miss Granger, please continue. Hermione swallowed, her voice stiff as she read the final rule. 3. Participation in this trial is not mandatory. However, those who choose to participate must sign this contract. By signing, you acknowledge the dangers of this trial. Should any injury or death occur, neither Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry nor Professor Amostar Brain of the Dark Arts Defense class will be held responsible. A collective gasp erupted. 70 or 80 students in the hallway immediately erupted into chaotic discussion. Amid the confusion, Hermione struggled to voice her opinion. This is illegal, Professor. The Ministry would never approve a disclaimer like this. Amasta shrugged nonchalantly. Let the Ministry deal with it, Miss Granger. I've said before, I do enjoy going against the rules. But Headmaster Dumbledore would never allow it, shouted Sophie Roper of Ravenclaw. Then let Headmaster Dumbledore come along as well. Ahem. Amasta cut himself off, switching to a friendly expression. In fact, Miss Roper, Headmaster Dumbledore has already approved my teaching plan. Of course, if you feel you lack the courage to face the unknown, you may choose not to participate. I said it's not mandatory. Is that even possible, Harry? Ron muttered, still reeling in shock. Dumbledore? How could he? I can't answer that, Ron. I only know one thing, Harry replied, his heart pounding so hard his face flushed. He couldn't tell whether it was fear or excitement coursing through him, but either way, it was exhilarating. Professor Amasta is serious. We'd better take this seriously. Hermione's eyes were glued to the parchment, searching for any loophole. Her trembling fingers betrayed just how effective Amasta's setup had been. You have 2 minutes to decide, Amasta said, turning and walking a few deliberate steps forward, leaving the bewildered students to debate amongst themselves. The students of Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Slytherin each reacted differently. Fear was universal. But most Gryffindor's eyes glimmered with a daring eagerness. Hermione quietly recited spells she might need. Neville's round eyes darted anxiously, hoping someone might give guidance, but no one could. The Ravenclaws were far calmer, analyzing whether the contract was a bluff with no real binding power. The Hufflepuffs were watching the reactions of the other houses, knowing their choices might be influenced by the decisions of the rest. The Slytherin students, ever skilled in self-preservation, were quietly retreating toward the back of the crowd, but Malfoy seemed to have made up his mind. His lips dry, he glanced at Crabbe, then at Goyle. Even the clumsy bulk he usually despised now seemed slightly fragile. Suddenly, an idea struck him, and he raised his hand. Professor Brain, if I decide to participate, can I choose my own teammates? Harry and Ron froze for a moment. This time, Malfoy had actually asked a good question. Unfortunately, Mr. Malfoy, 2 minutes passed in the blink of an eye before Amasta turned around, smiling warmly. To encourage interaction between the houses and to foster better understanding among the students, I will assign your teammates according to my own plan. Harry shifted nervously on his toes, suddenly recalling the duel Professor Snape had arranged for him in Lockhart's class. Then, the corridor fell silent. Only Amasta's voice echoed. He looked over the students, each with their own thoughts, and spread his arms in an inviting gesture. Ladies and gentlemen, make your choice. Chapter 62, Into the Trap. The final tally was in. Of roughly 160 to 170 first and second year students, more than half chose to opt out. Hufflepuff and Slytherin had the most dropouts, Ravenclaw next, and Gryffindor the fewest. The result wasn't particularly surprising. Amasta quickly divided those who had signed up into teams, 10 for first years and 11 for second years, making a total of 21 groups. Harry and Draco stood together, scowling at each other with mutual contempt. If you knelt down and begged me now, Potter, when some monster inevitably shoves you into its mouth, I might just mercifully gather your shredded bits for your foolish friends. At least they'd have something to remember you by. Malfoy sneered. I'm not impressed, Malfoy. Harry, living a sort of dream, met Malfoy's gray eyes without flinching. I thought you wouldn't even be able to walk straight without your two big thugs tagging along. At that moment, Amasta, having finished the team assignments, returned to the classroom door. Time is precious, everyone. Any volunteers to take the lead? Silence. The students who had already spent all their courage stared at their own feet, unwilling to meet Professor Brain's gaze. In that case, Amasta scanned the crowd again, disappointed by the lack of response. He then fixed his eyes on Harry and Malfoy, still silently challenging each other, and smiled brightly. Mr. Potter and Mr. Malfoy, please demonstrate your dazzling courage and intelligence for everyone. At the last moment, Harry regretted impulsively signing his name on the contract. He glanced back and saw Ron, Hermione, and even Neville watching him anxiously. For their sake, he forced a strained smile. Then, in full view of the crowd, he took a deep breath and reached for the door handle. Is it this one? Malfoy, meanwhile, no longer wore his usual sneer. Breathing heavily, he looked at Amasta almost pleadingly, hoping for a hint. Amasta ignored Malfoy's desperate gaze and addressed Harry, raising his voice slightly. Most dark creatures dislike light, Potter. The room may be dim. Be careful not to trip. If not for Hermione and Ron's encouraging voices from outside, or the fact that Malfoy hadn't yet fully closed the door behind him, Harry might have questioned whether he was even still inside the castle. He stared at the room before him, racking his brain for every spell he had learned or heard of, trying to figure out which charm could turn a normal classroom into a circular labyrinth the size of a Quidditch pitch. Click. When Malfoy finally shut the door, all light and sound from the hallway were cut off. The classroom instantly assumed the dim, oppressive gloom of a rainy late afternoon, just before the sun sets. The air was thick with cold smoke and the stench of rotting meat, the same foul odor Harry had noticed at Nearly Headless Nick's Death Day party. All around, there was silence. The only sound was the occasional plink of water droplets hitting the brown stone floor. In these conditions, Harry's vision was severely limited. He didn't dare move forward recklessly, trembling as he held his wand out in front of him, straining his eyes to pierce the thin veil of mist. Fear and the unknown had temporarily silenced Malfoy's usual hatred of Harry. Without realizing it, he shuffled close to Harry, taking careful, nervous steps, and even his tone had lost its usual arrogance. What do you think is waiting for us ahead, Potter? I know no more than you do, Malfoy, Harry replied, his voice calm, though not forceful. His eyes stayed steady, straining to penetrate the thin mist hanging in the air. Get over here, Draco. A low, familiar, ominous voice emerged from the mist, instantly bringing Malfoy back to full alertness and sinking Harry's anxious heart to the floor. And you, Potter, trying to dawdle your way through these 10 minutes? Too bad. Unless I announce the start and end, you'll remain in this room forever. Snape's tone was thick with disdain, but Harry had long grown accustomed to it. In fact, in this strange, dangerous environment, he even found the professor's disapproval somewhat comforting. Professor, are you here to guide me on how to defeat the dark creatures beyond the walls? Malfoy ran to the entrance of the labyrinth, his face lighting up as he addressed the professor who had always taken the most interest in him. Can you tell me what's inside? Any tips for handling it? You'll have to rely on yourself, Draco. Professor Brain even made me sign a magical contract forbidding me from revealing anything. Recalling being forced to sign the contract by the ever-smiling Amasta, Snape's face grew stern. What he said next wiped the grin off Malfoy's face completely. Headmaster Dumbledore and Professor Bran assigned me here to minimize casualties in this dangerous undertaking. Snape looked at Harry, who was 5 feet away, nervously scanning the maze entrance. A faint, malicious smile appeared on his lips as he spoke in his usual lightly sarcastic classroom tone. But you should know, Draco, if danger strikes suddenly, I may not have time to pull both of you out of a monster's jaws. Harry knew this warning was meant for him. If he and Malfoy faced danger at the same time, it was obvious who Snape would save first. Professor, Harry feigned ignorance of the implication, pointing his wand at a thick, brown liquid slowly dripping from the right side of the maze entrance. His voice came out sharper than he realized. That can't be. Blood, right? Hissing, Malfoy noticed it too. He gasped sharply and instinctively turned to run for the door, but Snape grabbed his shoulder. Professor Brain's magical contract carries a powerful binding. Once signed, it cannot be abandoned. Draco, your father won't be pleased to see you turn into a useless coward. From the moment they stepped into the classroom, there was no turning back. No matter how terrified Harry and Draco under Snape's sharp gaze, each chose an entrance and cautiously stepped into the maze, thick with an aura of death and misfortune. Their small, lonely figures quickly vanished into the dark, hungry shadows. Harry now walked through a corridor about 10 feet wide, the walls and ceiling mottled and rough, all at the same height. It was even darker than before. The faint light allowed him just enough to see his fingers. Bumping into the wall reminded him he could use his wand to create some illumination. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat echoing. The gloomy, endless passage was intermittently shrouded by pale, ghostly mists that glowed faintly, like the shimmer of a spirit. The maze felt like an ancient magical ruin, buried deep beneath the earth for 1,000 years. Water stains seeped from the walls, nurturing thick carpets of green moss in the corners, while the dark brown floor tiles became slick and treacherous. To avoid slipping, Harry sidled forward carefully, each step deliberate, moving like a crab across the wet stones. The path behind him vanished quickly into darkness, while the way ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty. Harry, pale and tense, had to admit, this tomb-like maze was the most terrifying place he had ever seen in his life. Has Professor Brain really explored this maze himself? The eerie silence and creeping dread warped Harry's sense of time. He felt as though he had wandered the endless corridors for an hour, though in reality barely 2 minutes had passed. At least, I can't let Malfoy beat me. He pressed his lips together, forcing down the constant urge to turn back, and continued moving forward. The glow from his wand illuminated a monotonous, repetitive scene, yet the very tedium of the walls and corridors seemed to heighten his imagination of every possible danger. Harry shivered, wondering how Ron or Hermione might react here, and Neville, he was almost certain, would faint outright. Could it be that Professor Brain tricked us all, just to scare everyone with this grim maze? The thought flitted through Harry's mind as he trudged forward, still seeing no sign of any living creature. But knowing Brain's methodical style, he dismissed the notion as unlikely. The darkness deepened. Every breath he exhaled condensed into swirling clouds in the cold air, making it feel as though he had stepped into a refrigerated vault. Drip, drip. The farther he walked, the more humid the air became, tiny droplets clinging to his hair. Finally, the terrain ahead changed. Harry's heart thudded with a mix of anticipation and relief. The only things keeping him grounded were his wand and the cold, unyielding walls. Ah, just a small stream. His pulse eased when he realized the obstacle wasn't anything more threatening. The narrow corridor was crossed by a 10-foot-wide water channel, completely blocking his path. Why had Professor Brain put a little stream here? In the dim light, Harry studied the surface, thick with dark green algae and a rotting log floating in the middle, emitting a faint stench of stagnant water. The path behind him remained swallowed by darkness. He had a sneaking suspicion that Snape lurked unseen, waiting to ridicule him. One false step backward, and the professor would appear, mocking his failure in the contest of courage against Malfoy. Harry, representing Gryffindor's courage, refused to face such humiliation. He would rather drown in the stream before him than admit defeat to Slytherin. Exhaling sharply, he steeled himself. There was no turning back. 10 feet was not an easy jump, but as Hogwarts' youngest seeker in nearly a century, brimming with athletic energy, Harry found it manageable. He focused on the rotting log, pushing aside the algae floating in the water. Professor Brain left this log here to help us cross, Harry thought. He took 2 steps back, drew a deep breath, and leapt. His feet landed heavily on the log midstream, easily clearing the channel. The water made the far side colder than the corridors he had traversed, and an uneasy sense of danger lingered. Without hesitation, he continued forward, disappearing into the gloom. Drip, drip. Condensation fell from the freezing walls into the stream, disturbing the log Harry had used as a stepping stone. It floated toward the bank, gently nudged by the rippling water. No one noticed. In the endless darkness, a pale, marble-like hand suddenly emerged from the water, gripping the solid floor. The maze itself was far from uniform. Besides the twisting corridors, there were small rooms with semicircular domed ceilings, purpose unknown. Using his initial impression upon entering the classroom and a vague memory of the paths he had taken, Harry judged that he had likely reached the maze's center. A small relief washed over him. At least he was slightly ahead of Malfoy. Before him stretched a straight corridor. Harry raised his wand, the tip glowing, but within 30 feet, nothing had changed, except for a large hole in the ceiling some steps ahead, yawning darkly into the shadows. Where on earth did Professor Brain find a place like this? By now, Harry was fairly certain that Professor Brain had recreated a location he had once visited. A maze this complex, with such realistic details, could never have been conjured purely from imagination. Thinking this, Harry's mind pictured Brain's young, handsome face and that ever-present smile that seemed immune to any surprise or danger. Harry had thought he knew the professor a little, but now he realized he had never truly seen what lay beneath that enigmatic facade. Compared to before, Harry's steps grew lighter as he gradually adjusted to the darkness and silence. He was beginning to believe that Brain had painstakingly created this eerie maze simply to test their courage. All the words in the corridor and the magical contract they had been made to sign were merely designed to make them anxious. That made sense. So far, the heir of Slytherin had only petrified Filch's cat and Colin and Justin. Yet that alone had caused panic from the headmaster down to every professor. If Brain had really carried out the terrifying threats he hinted at, the young wizards might have suffered serious injury, or worse. No one could have survived such consequences. Realizing this, the oppressive, icy atmosphere around him seemed much friendlier. Harry wiped the sweat from his forehead and even allowed a faint smile to curl at the corner of his lips. Clever Brain, he muttered to himself. He hadn't forgotten that Brain had given each pair just 10 minutes to complete the maze. If he didn't exit in time, both he and Malfoy would be marked as failures. Even if Harry had made more progress inside, there would be nothing to brag about. 1,000 thoughts raced through Harry's mind. Why hadn't he seen a trace of Malfoy so far? Could Snape have broken the rules and secretly guided Malfoy along a safer path through the maze? Knowing Snape, it wasn't impossible. The thought made Harry a little anxious. He rubbed his sore right shoulder and prepared to quicken his pace, just as a sudden, piercing, terrified scream erupted from the darkness ahead, turning his face ghostly pale again. Chapter 64. The Shadowed Corpse Bang. The scream came without warning. Harry slipped and fell hard onto the ground, but he barely noticed the sting in his rear, his terrified eyes fixed on the rolling shadows ahead. There was no doubt. The scream had come from Malfoy, and it sounded unnervingly close. Malfoy was in danger. The maze really did contain deadly dark creatures. In mere seconds, Harry's undershirt was soaked with sweat. Trembling, he scrambled to his feet and instinctively ran in the direction they had come, too panicked to think. But after just a few steps, he froze again, a conflicted expression crossing his pale, bloodless face. The presence of dark creatures confirmed that Brain had not been lying, which meant the casualties mentioned in the magical contract were a real possibility. At Hogwarts, Malfoy was Harry's most hated classmate, and Harry was, without question, Malfoy's most despised rival. They were natural enemies. If given the chance, each would have expelled the other from Hogwarts without hesitation. That was an undeniable truth. That didn't mean Harry actually wanted to see Malfoy die. The thought of death made him shiver again. Unbidden, a horrifying image sprang into his mind. A cold, lifeless body lying in a pitch-dark corridor, eyes soaked in blood. Beside it crouched a furry, monstrous creature with jagged claws and sharp teeth, tearing into the corpse with relish. Mind your own business, Harry. Malfoy won't thank you, and besides, Snape's out there watching. Harry's lips went pale as he muttered to himself, trying to quell his conscience. But no matter how he tried, the image from before seemed nailed to his mind, refusing to vanish. Damn it! Malfoy, this is the one time in my life. After a painful inner struggle, his innate sense of right prevailed over fear and disgust. He turned toward the direction of the screams, shouting as loudly as he could. Where are you, Malfoy? If you're still breathing, yell back! At first, there was no reply. Then, a series of rapid footsteps approached from the corridor ahead, coming closer and closer. Harry stumbled backward, his heart hammering so hard he felt it might burst from his chest. Who's there? He shouted, and the answer came immediately. Malfoy stumbled out of the darkness, rolling and scrambling, utterly disheveled. Harry swore he had never seen Malfoy like this. The usual sneer and haughty expression were gone, replaced with tears and snot streaking his face. Blood stained his hair and forehead, dark and fresh like the patch they had seen on the wall before entering the maze. His robes had been torn to tatters, one shoulder dangling loosely. But when he saw Harry, joy exploded in his eyes, an expression Harry would never have expected to see on Malfoy's face. Harry allowed himself a brief, incredulous thought. It was strangely wonderful to see Malfoy happy to see him. But he quickly suppressed it. Now was no time for distractions. What did you see? From 20 feet away, Harry demanded, but Malfoy didn't answer. He trembled as he ran toward Harry, finally collapsing in front of him and gripping his arm. Dead bodies. Potter. I saw them. Corpses. Malfoy's face was no longer merely pale, it was ghostly. His eyes were unfocused, as if terror had shattered all defenses. The bodies, above me. I was walking through the maze, thinking about turning back, and a drop of blood fell from the ceiling, and then white eyes. It was chasing me. Malfoy's words tumbled over one another. Harry could feel the full weight of Malfoy leaning against him. Without support, he was certain Malfoy would have collapsed entirely. Stop talking nonsense, Malfoy, Harry snapped, though even his voice trembled. Professor Brain said there are dark creatures here, but he never said there'd be corpses. And corpses don't chase you, right? You don't understand him, Potter. Malfoy's sudden outburst struck like lightning. His face burned as he yelled, You don't understand Amostar Brain at all. He's a dark wizard. I've seen the ruthless side of him in private. The words seemed to exhaust Malfoy's remaining reason. He shook off Harry's support, staggering toward the way he had come, muttering fragments like run and get out, lost in his panic. Harry's breathing quickened again, fear filling him, as he watched Malfoy vanish into the darkness, stuck between staying and fleeing. Rustle. Then came a strange dragging sound from the direction Malfoy had fled, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. Gulp. Harry swallowed hard, his wand trembling as its glow pointed toward the sound. Every nerve in his body screamed. Should he face the dark creature or turn and run? Professor Brain wouldn't make us fight something way beyond our ability. Right? Harry pressed his dry lips together, forcing his remaining wits to work. He struggled to persuade himself not to run, forcing his eyes wide to stare toward the source of the sound. He had to see what truly lay in the maze for himself. He couldn't rely solely on Malfoy's terrified ramblings. Waiting was torture. Every second dragged as though slowed by magic. Harry edged along the wall, pressing his back to the cold stone, bracing himself for the moment when fear would finally strike. Even though Harry had been warning himself ever since stepping into this classroom that he might face unprecedented fears, things more terrifying than Hagrid's dog, Fluffy, or even a bandaged-up Quirrell, when that creature emerged from the darkness, Harry felt as if his entire respiratory system had been submerged in ice water. Every breath burned, and the mental defense he had carefully built collapsed instantly. It really was a corpse. Malfoy hadn't lied. A female body, dressed in tattered, ancient clothes, her scalp decayed with sparse, long hair, her lifeless eyes as pale as her skin, a rotten, deathly white corpse. Harry realized immediately, for he had never seen anyone with a dagger impaled in their heart who could still move. J. A strange, chattering sound escaped Harry's mouth, the clattering of teeth. Oddly enough, he felt a twinge of admiration for Malfoy. This close to a creature like this, Malfoy still had the energy to run. That was no small feat. Run! That was the only thought racing through Harry's mind. Why could the body of someone dead for so long move? What kind of evil creature had Professor Brand summoned? How could one possibly defeat a corpse already embraced by death? These questions